Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the crown weighs heavy and mercy is a luxury few can afford. Imagine you're trudging through a medieval marketplace, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and the clang of blacksmiths' hammers. But beneath the bustle, there's a shadow, a whisper of fear that follows the name of the king. These aren't the fairy tale rulers of bedtime stories. These are the brutal kings of history, men who wielded power like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. And let's be honest, if you were living under their rule, you probably wouldn't survive this. Unless you were quick with a sword or quicker with your wits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of a medieval kingdom, where the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the distant clang of armor. The year is somewhere between the 5th and 15th centuries. History's a bit fuzzy on the specifics, but one thing's crystal clear. This is the age of kings, and not the kind you'd want to bump into in a dark alley. These aren't the polished royals of fairy tales sipping tea and petting unicorns. No, these are the brutal kings of history, rulers who didn't just wear crowns. They forged them in blood, sweat, and the tears of their enemies. Welcome to the Dark Ages, where brutality wasn't just a trait, it was a survival skill. Picture yourself as a peasant, knee-deep in mud, toiling in the fields from dawn till dusk. Your back aches, your hands are calloused, and your only break is a fleeting glance at the horizon. But you're not dreaming of the harvest or the next village festival. You're thinking about him, the king. His name drifts through the air, whispered in terror or growled in defiance. Hez, the man who holds your fate in his hands, who can grant you a scrap of land or take your head with a flick of his royal wrist. In this era, the line between a benevolent ruler and a tyrant is thinner than a dagger's edge, and most of these kings didn't bother tiptoeing along it. So what makes a king brutal? Is it the body count racked up in their dungeons, or the way they crushed rebellions like ants underfoot? It's a bit of both, sure, but it's also about the sheer audacity of their actions. These weren't rulers who governed quietly from a throne room. They dominated. They were the kind of men who'd invite you to dinner, all smiles and charm, then serve your brothers head on a platter just to remind you who's boss. And trust me, you didn't want to be the one who forgot to RSVP. Let's start with Vlad the Impaler, the Wallachian prince, whose name still sends shivers down spines. You've probably heard of him as the inspiration for Dracula, but the real story is bloodier than any vampire tale. Vlad's favorite hobby: impaling people, literally skewering them on stakes and leaving them to writhe in agony. And he didn't stop at a handful of unlucky souls. He turned it into a grotesque art form, lining roads with forests of stakes, each topped with a body. It was his twisted version of a welcome sign, "Don't mess with me." Even the Ottoman Empire, no stranger to ruthlessness, paused before tangling with him. Legend says he once invited disloyal nobles to a feast, locked the doors, and burned the place down dinner, and a show Vlad style. Then there's Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar, and a masterclass in paranoia. Ivan didn't just suspect treason. He saw it in every shadow. He'd execute anyone who crossed his mind as a threat, nobles, peasants. Even his own son, whom he allegedly killed in a fit of rage with a staff to the head. Family reunions at Ivan's palace must've been a blast. His secret police, the oprichniki, roamed the land in black, slaughtering entire towns to keep dissent in check. If Vlad was a blunt instrument, Ivan was a sledgehammer crude, chaotic and devastating. Across the Channel, England had its own share of brutal royalty. Take Richard III, the King Shakespeare turned into a hunchbacked bogeyman. Historians still bicker over whether he really murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower, to secure his throne. What's undisputed is his ruthlessness on the battlefield and off. He cut down rivals with cold efficiency, and when he fell at Bosworth Field in 1485, it was with a ferocity that cemented his legend. Villain or misunderstood warrior? That's your call, but either way, he wasn't handing out hugs. And then, there's King John, the black sheep of the Plantagenet dynasty. This guy was so loathed that his own barons ganged up on him, forcing him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, basically a medieval chill-out dude contract. Did it reform him? Nope. John kept taxing, torturing, and terrorizing until he keeled over from dysentery. Probably the only time his enemies got a break. He once starved a noblewoman and her son to death in a dungeon just to flex his power. Subtlety wasn't his strong suit. But the creativity in cruelty didn't stop there. William the Conqueror, the Norman king, who stormed England in 1066, had a knack for scorched earth tactics. When the North rebelled, he didn't just quell at the torched villages, salted fields, and left thousands to starve. It was called the harrying of the North, and it was so brutal that even chroniclers of the time winced. And Henry VIII sure is famous for his 6 wives, but he also had a hobby of beheading anyone who disagreed with him, friends, advisors, even 2 of those wives. Guy had a real knack for turning till death do us part into a to-do list. Across the Channel, Louis XIII of France, dubbed the spider-spun webs of intrigue that make a modern spy blush. He didn't always get his hands dirty. Why bother when you could pit your enemies against each other and watch them implode? But when push came to shove, he'd lock rivals in iron cages or execute them with a smile. It was less about bloodlust and more about control, but the end result was the same, a kingdom trembling at his feet. Why were these kings so brutal? Well, the medieval world wasn't exactly a picnic. Power wasn't just inherited. It was clawed from the hands of rivals, often with swords still dripping. Once you had the throne keeping, it meant constant vigilance. Rebellions popped up like weeds, and loyalty was a rare commodity. It was a dog-eat-dog world, and these kings were the alpha wolves baring teeth to keep the pack in line. Take Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, for instance. Before he died, trying to snatch England's throne in 1066, he spent years as a mercenary, hacking his way across Europe and the Byzantine Empire. His nickname, Hard Ruler, wasn't just for show. He crushed dissent with a war axe and a glare. Or consider Basil the Sin of Byzantium, the Bulgar Slayer. After defeating the Bulgarians, he blinded 15,000 prisoners, leaving 1 in every 100 with a single eye to guide the rest home, a chilling message to anyone dreaming of rebellion. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy. These kings wanted their names carved into history, feared and revered in equal measure. They ruled with an iron fist because anything less risked fading into obscurity. And centuries later here, we are still whispering their name, proof they got what they wanted, for better or worse. So as you kick back in your modern comfort, spare a thought for those who lived under these brutal kings. Imagine the weight of their rule, the fear, the uncertainty, the ever-present shadow of violence. It's enough to make you grateful for the mundane peace of your own life. But don't relax just yet. In the next section, we're plunging deeper into the bloody path to power. These kings didn't just inherit their thrones, they seized them, leaving trails of bodies and broken dreams in their wake. It's a grim climb to the top, and trust me, it's not for the faint of heart. Imagine standing in a medieval throne room, the air heavy with the musk of ambition, and the faint clink of armor. Shadows flicker across stone walls as courtiers exchange whispered plots, their smiles as sharp as the daggers they conceal. In this world, power isn't handed over on a silver platter. It's wrested from the hands of rivals, forged in blood and held with an iron grip. Medieval kings didn't just rule. They clawed their way to the top, driven by a relentless hunger that left betrayal, violence, and cunning as their legacy. Let's step into this brutal game of thrones and meet the players who redefined ruthlessness, the precarious game of power. In the Middle Ages, a crown wasn't a guarantee of authority, it was a target. Kings faced threats from every corner, rebellious nobles, rival claimants, even their own kin. Legitimacy was a slippery thing, often resting on a shaky bloodline or a hastily sworn oath. To claim and keep a throne, a king needed more than a royal title. He needed audacity, a willingness to spill blood, and a knack for turning enemies into stepping stones. The medieval world was a chessboard where every move could end in checkmate, and the pieces were human lives. Masters of the power grab. William the Conqueror, the Norman hammer. Take William the Conqueror, a man who didn't just want power, he demanded it. In 1066, as Duke of Normandy, he set his sights on England's throne, undeterred by the English Channel or King Harold II's army. The Battle of Hastings was his proving ground, a brutal slugfest of arrows and axes, where Harold fell again, says, with an arrow through the eye, and William rose. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. To cement his rule, William unleashed the harrying of the North, a scorched earth campaign that razed villages, slaughtered thousands, and starved survivors into submission. His Domesday Book wasn't just a record. It was a chokehold taxing every inch of his new kingdom. William's ambition didn't just win him a crown, it remade England in his image at a cost etched in its soil. Louis XV, the spider's web across the Channel. Louis XV of France played a subtler but no less ruthless game. Nicknamed the Spider, he wove intricate webs of intrigue to trap his foes. France in the 15th century was a fractured realm, its nobles wielding power like petty kings. Louis had no patience for that. With spies in every court and whispers in every ear, he turned allies against each other, using bribes, blackmail, and strategic marriages to tighten his grip. His enemies, like the Duke of Burgundy, found themselves outmaneuvered their strength, sapped by Louis's quiet schemes. He once bragged, "I am France," and he backed it up, locking rivals in cages and centralizing power with a patience as deadly as any sword. His ambition was a slow poison, but it killed just as surely. Henry IV, the usurper's burden. In England, Henry IV took a more direct route. In 1399, he overthrew his cousin Richard II in a coup dripping with family betrayal. Richard was imprisoned, starved to death in Pontefract Castle, and Henry snatched the crown. But stolen thrones come with baggage. Rebels like Henry Hotspur Percy challenged his rule, leading to the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. Hotspur nearly won, but Henry's forces prevailed, leaving fields soaked in blood and his reign shaky. His 14 years as king were a constant fight to prove his legitimacy, a reminder that power grabbed in haste is a fragile thing. Henry's ambition won him the throne, but it cursed him with a reign of unrest. Even the terrible, the Tsars, terror. Far to the east, Ivan Ivlater dubbed the terrible turned ruthlessness into a reign of terror. Crowned Russia's first Tsar in 1547, he faced a nobility, the boyars, who saw him as a figurehead. Ivan disagreed. In 1565, he launched the Oprichnina, splitting Russia into his personal domain and the boyars' lands. His Oprichniki, a black-clad force of enforcers, became his fist-crushing descent with horrifying zeal. The massacre of Novgorod in 1570 was his brutal masterpiece. Thousands tortured, drowned, or impaled on suspicion of treason, real or imagined. Ivan's ambition wasn't just to rule, it was to obliterate any hint of resistance, leaving Russia a trembling shadow of his will. The human toll. These kings didn't climb alone. They dragged entire kingdoms with them, often to ruin. William's harrying left northern England a wasteland, its people starved and homeless. Louis' schemes sparked wars that bled the French peasantry dry. Henry's rebellions turned England into a battlefield, with common folk paying the price in taxes and lives. And Ivan's purges. They left Russia a land of widows and orphans, where fear was a daily ration. These power grabs weren't just noble feuds. They were catastrophes for the powerless caught beneath the crown's shadow. Yet in their time, these kings weren't always villains. A strong ruler could mean stability in a chaotic world, and their ruthlessness was often the glue holding fractured realms together. But that doesn't erase the blood on their hands. They didn't just seize power. They tore it from the world around them, leaving a legacy of awe and horror. If you think these tales are grim, brace yourself. The next chapter takes us to Wallachia, where Vlad the Impaler turned brutality into a twisted art. His path to power was a forest of stakes, each one a testament to an ambition that didn't just conquer, it terrified. Let's step into his shadow and see what happens when ruthlessness becomes legend. Picture this, it's the 15th century, and you're trudging through the muddy plains of Wallachia, a rugged little patch of land caught between two snarling giants, the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. The wind carries a faint metallic tang, and as you crest a hill, you see it, a forest of stakes, each topped with a grim human decoration. This is the domain of Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, or if you're feeling fancy, Vlad Dracula. He's the guy who turned tough on crime into a literal bloodbath. But who was this medieval madman, a psycho with a pointy stick, or a misunderstood patriot? Let's dig into the dirt and blood of his story. From hostage to hard case, Vlad wasn't born with a stake in his hand. He had to earn it the hard way. Born in 1431, he was the son of Vlad the Sin Dracul, a big shot in the Order of the Dragon, a knightly crew tasked with keeping the Ottomans at bay. Dracul means dragon, but it also nods to devil, which is about as subtle as a sledgehammer for what's coming. Young Vlad's life took a sharp turn when his dad shipped him and his brother Radu off to the Ottoman court as hostages. It was a peace deal, sure, but imagine being a kid stuck in a foreign palace, watching the Sultan's enforcers skewer folks for fun. That's Vlad's origin story, a masterclass in fear and survival. He got out eventually, but home wasn't much cozier. Wallachia was a mess with his dad murdered, and the throne bouncing between Ottoman and Hungarian puppets. In 1448, Vlad, barely 17, grabbed power with Ottoman help, only to lose it fast. He bounced back in 1456, this time with Hungarian muscle, and that's when the real Vlad show began. 3 reigns, countless corpses, and a nickname that stuck like gore on a blade. Impalement, the signature move. Let's talk about Vlad's MVP, move impalement. This wasn't your average execution, it was slow, It was public, and it was personal. They'd take a sharpened stake, sometimes greased up for extra slippage, and drive it through the body, usually starting at the backside and working up. The trick? Keep the victim alive as long as possible, letting gravity and time do the rest. Vlad turned fields into nightmare galleries, stakes poking up like a twisted picket fence. Why so extra? It was psychological warfare on steroids. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II rolled up with his Ottoman army, ready to squash Wallachia. What did he find? A welcome mat of 20,000 impaled soldiers rotting in the sun. Even Mehmed, who'd seen some stuff, said nope and hightailed it out. Vlad didn't just kill, he branded fear into history. Cruelty? The full menu impalement was the headliner, but Vlad's cruelty had a whole buffet. He once threw a dinner party for some uppity nobles, then had them impaled mid-meal talk about a power move. Ottoman envoys showed up and wouldn't ditch their turbans. Vlad nailed them on, proving he wasn't big on cultural sensitivity. Then, there's the time he invited Wallachia's poor to a feast, locked the doors, and torched the place. His excuse: no more freeloaders. Harsh, even by medieval standards. He didn't stop at enemies. Steal a loaf of bread, impaled. Cheat on your spouse, skinned alive. Vlad left a gold cup in a town square, once daring anyone to take it. Spoiler, it stayed put. His Wallachia was a land where you'd rather starve than sneeze wrong. The big picture: politics and power. Vlad's bloodlust wasn't random, he was playing a deadly game. Wallachia was a chew toy between the Ottomans and Hungarians, and Vlad picked a side his own. He saw himself as a Christian bulwark against the Turks, but he wasn't about to kiss Hungarian rings either. His impalement, forests, a middle finger to both. He hit Ottoman camps at night, slashing throats while they slept, and purged Wallachias, scheming boyars to lock down his rule. It worked, sort of. He kept the Ottomans guessing and the nobles in line, but it was a tightrope walk. One wrong step, and he'd be the one on a stick. His brutality was less mwahaha and more survive or die. Life under the spike. For Wallachia's peasants, Vlad was a mixed bag. Sure, you could walk the streets without getting mugged, mostly because thieves were dangling overhead. Trade picked up and the corrupt elite got a taste of their own medicine. But the cost a reign of terror, where a rumor could end your family tree. Vlad's fans say he brought justice. His critics say he brought a body count. Either way, he left Wallachia tougher and quieter than he found it. Madman or mastermind. So was Vlad a nutcase or a genius tough call? His Ottoman hostage days probably didn't help his sunny disposition, and some say he got off on the gore. But his letters like one, to Hungary's, King Paint, a guy obsessed with order, not just chaos. He impaled kids, sure, but he also built a state. Maybe he was both a calculator with a cruel streak shaped by a world that didn't reward nice guys. The Dracula effect. Vlad's Zen came in 1476, captured, jailed, a brief comeback, then dead in battle. But death was just Act 1. Centuries later, Bram Stoker turned Dracula into a cape-wearing icon, while Romania recast Vlad as a gritty hero. Tourists flocked to his old haunts, snapping pics where blood once flowed. He's proof that a bad guy can still win the PR war. Vlad's stakes were brutal, but Ivan the Terrible took tyranny to a whole new level. Russia's first Tsar turned his court into a slaughterhouse fueled by paranoia and power. Next section, well swap Wallachia's forests for Moscow's icy streets, and see how Ivan made Vlad look like a warm-up act. Imagine yourself in the Kremlin. The year is 1547, and the air hums with tension. The stone walls, cold and unyielding, have borne witness to centuries of scheming, but they've never seen anything quite like Ivan Nervsun, to be dubbed Ivan the Terrible. Has Russia's first Tsar a title dripping with imperial ambition, and his reign is a wild ride from reform to ruin. You can almost hear the clinking of armor and the whispers of conspiracy as Ivan's story unfolds. A tale of power, paranoia, and a brutality that would echo through history. Let's dive into the frozen streets of Moscow and watch a kingdom buckle under its unhinged ruler. A childhood. Forged in fire, Ivan's life starts with a punch to the gut. Born in 1530, he's barely 3 when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, keels over, leaving the toddler as heir to a restless Muscovy. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, steps up as regent, but she's dead by the time Ivan's 8 poisoned the rumors hissed by the boyars, Russia's noble elite. Picture it, a scrawny kid, orphaned, trapped in a palace crawling with vipers. The boyars treat him like a puppet, fawning over him one minute, locking him in a room with no food the next. They even slit the throats of his allies in front of him, a lesson in power he'd never forget. By 13, Ivan's done playing victim. He sicks a pack of dogs on Andrei Shwisky, a boyar who'd crossed him one too many times, and watches as the nobles shredded to bits. The kid's not just surviving us, sharpening his claws. At 16, Ivan seizes the throne in a move that screams audacity. He doesn't settle for Grand Prince. He crowns himself Tsar, a nod to the Caesars of old Rome, staking his claim as Russia's supreme ruler. The early days dazzle. He's got vision. He sets up the Zemsky Sobor, a rough draft of a parliament, codifies laws, and pushes Russia's borders outward. Kazan and Astrakhan fall cracking open Siberia, and he even swaps letters with England's Queen Elizabeth I about trade. For a hot second, you'd think Ivan's a Renaissance man in fur boots. But those childhood scars, they are festering, waiting to erupt. The good years. A false dawn. Let's linger on those early wins. Ivan's not just a warlord, is a builder. The Zemsky Sobor gives the gentry a voice, a step toward centralizing power. He revamps the legal code, taming some of the chaos left by feudal lords. His armies steamroll the Tatar Khanates, planting Russia's flag deep into Asia. It's a golden age, relatively speaking, and Ivan's riding high. But you can't outrun your demons, and his are closing in. The crack. Anastasia's death. The tipping point comes in 1560. Ivan's wife, Anastasia Romanovna Dees, some say naturally, others whisper poison, pointing fingers at the boyars. She was his anchor, the one person he trusted in a world of knives. Her loss guts him. You can almost see him pacing the Kremlin, eyes wild, muttering about betrayal. The grief twists into paranoia, and the Tsar, who once dreamed of progress, now sees enemies in every shadow. He retreats, brooding, and when he emerges, the reformer's dead. In his place, a man ready to burn it all down. The Oprichnina, Russia's nightmare. By 1565, Ivan's paranoia is in the driver's seat. He splits Russia in two, the Oprichnina, his private fiefdom, and the Zemshchina, left to the boyars he despises. To run his half, he unleashes the Oprichnika. Think of them as the world's worst house guests. Dressed in black, riding black horses, they carry dogs, heads and brooms. They'll sniff out treason and sweep it clean. These guys aren't just enforcers. They're Ivan's personal death squad with a blank check to loot, torture, and kill. The Oprichniki tear through Russia like a plague. Boyar estates burn, families vanish, and villages empty out. Ivan's not subtle. He hosts dinners for nobles, clinks glasses, then has them hacked apart before the soup's cold. He's got a flair for the dramatic, forcing boyars to play monks confessing sins before the axe falls. It's not enough to kill. He wants them humiliated, erased. The Oprichnina's less a policy and more a tantrum, and Russia bleeds for it. Novgorod's doomblood on the ice. Ivan's cruelty peaks in 1570 with the massacre of Novgorod. The cities accused of cozying up to Poland. Lithuaniano proof needed just Ivan's gut. He sends the Oprichniki, and for 5 weeks, Novgorod drowns in blood. They slaughter indiscriminately men, women, kids, dumping bodies into the Folkov River until it chokes on corpses. Numbers are fuzzy, but thousands die, maybe tens of thousands. Ivan's there hands-on, torturing priests and merchants himself, grinning through the screams. It's not justice, it's annihilation. Novgorod's, a warning cross even in your world ends. A son's blood, the ultimate sin. Even family isn't safe. In 1581, Ivan's temper flares during a row with his son Ivan Ivanovich. Maybe it's about the kid's wife, maybe it's just a bad details blur. Ivan Sr. swings his staff, cracks his son's skull, and the prince dies days later. The Tsar's a wreck clawing at his beard, wailing, but tears don't undo it. He's killed his heir, torched his dynasty. The scene's pure tragedy, a father's rage, snuffing out his own future. The fallout, a kingdom in tatters, Ivan's reign, guts Russia. The Oprichnina leaves the land-scarred fields, raised peasants, scattered trade stalled. Wars bleed the coffers dry, and famine creeps in. The boyars, once a thorn in his side, are decimated, but so's the state's backbone. When Ivan dies in 1584 mid-chess game, they say Russia's a husk. His son Fyodor's too weak to hold it together, and the time of troubles looms. Ivan's dream of power comes at a hell of a price. Legacy tyrant or trailblazer? What's Ivan's deal anyway? Historians can't agree. He smashed the boyars, centralized the state, and stretched Russia's reach-big wins for a fledgling empire. Some call him a brutal necessity, a hammer forging a nation. Others see a madman, his paranoia a wrecking ball. Truth is, he's both a visionary with a butcher's hands. Russia bears his mark for better and worse. Ivan's terror shaped Russia, but over in England another king's dark legend brews. Richard III, hunchbacked schemer, or wronged ruler. His tails got missing, prince's a stolen crown, and enough spin to make your head spin. Let's swap Moscow's ice for London's gloom and unravel his story. Welcome to the blood-soaked tapestry of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses turned family reunions into battlefields and the crown into a deadly heirloom. Enter Richard III, a king whose name conjures images of a twisted spine and a trail of corpses. History has branded him a villain, but is that the whole story? Was he a scheming tyrant, or just a man playing a ruthless game with the cards he was dealt? Let's wade through the muck of myth and fact to find out. The rise of a shadow king, born in 1452. Richard Plantagenet was the runt of the York litter, overshadowed by his strapping brothers, Edward and George. His father, the Duke of York, had a claim to the throne that sparked the wars of the Rosicsa Civil War, so messy it makes modern politics look like a tea party. Richard grew up in this chaos, a wiry lad with a keen mind and a taste for power. By 18, he was swinging a sword at Barnet and Tewkesbury, helping Edward IV smash the Lancastrians and claim the crown. Edward's reign was a golden age for the Yorks until he dropped dead in 1483, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as king. Richard, named Lord Protector, was supposed to be the kid's guardian. Instead, he saw an opening. With a mix of cunning and questionable legality, he declared Edward IV's marriage, invalid the kids, illegitimate, and himself the rightful king. In July 1483, he was crowned Richard III. Ambition 1. Nephews 0. The princes in the tower, a grim whodunit. Now we hit the juicy part, the mystery that's kept historians bickering for centuries. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were packed off to the Tower of London for their safety. Spoiler, they didn't come back out. By late 1483, they'd vanished, and the rumor mill kicked into overdrive. Did Uncle Richard have them snuffed out with a pillow? In the night, theories swirl like flies on a battlefield corpse. The traditional tale pins it on Richard. Why else would a usurper king let potential rivals breathe? But hold your pitchforks. Some point to Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, who toppled Richard and had his own motives to tidy up loose ends. Others whisper the boys might have escaped living incognito while the grown-ups fought over their birthright. Bones dug up in the tower in 1674, too. Kids roughly the right ages fuel the fire, but without modern DNA confirmation, thanks royal veto, we're stuck guessing. Richard's fans say there's no smoking gun, but good luck scrubbing that bloodstain off his reputation. A reign cut short. Richard's time on the throne was less a golden era and more a frantic scramble. Crowned in 1483, he tried to play the good king, card-passing laws to shield the poor from greedy landlords and setting up a council for commoners' grievances. Not bad for a guy painted as a cartoon villain. But the crown sat heavy. Rebellions sprouted like weeds, and Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian exile with a flimsy claim, was gathering an army across the Channel. Richard faced his reckoning at Bosworth Field in August 1485. Picture it, a muddy clash of steel Richard in armor charging toward Tudor with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He was inches from victory when his ally Lord Stanley pulled a Judas move, switching sides mid-battle. Richard went down, fighting hacked to pieces the last English king to die in combat. His naked corpse was slung over a horse and dumped in Leicester until 2012, when archaeologists found him under a parking lot, his scoliosis-curved spine proving Shakespeare wasn't entirely making it up. The bard's bogeyman. Speaking of Shakespeare, he turned Richard into the poster boy for a villa, limping, cackling schemer who'd kill his own granny for a crown. Now is the winter of our discontent. He growls, and suddenly, Richard's a hunchbacked Hannibal Lecter. Brilliant theater, but dodgy history. Shakespeare wrote under Tudor rule, and Henry VII's PR team needed a monster to justify their takeover. Richard was the perfect fall guy. Modern scholars aren't so sure. Some argue he was no worse than the average medieval king, ruthless sure, but not uniquely so. His laws hint at a reformist streak, and his guts at Bosworth were undeniable. The prince's a convenient crime for multiple players. Still, the Shakespearean smear stuck, proving that a good story beats a fair one any day. Legacy from car park to controversy. Richard's tale didn't rot with his bones. His 2012 rediscovery sparked a reassessment. His reburial in 2015 was practically a state funeral. The Richard III Society fights to redeem him, claiming he's been slandered by Victors Inc. Villain or victim? Maybe he's neither, just a man who gambled big and lost bigger. History's still arguing, and that's half the fun. Bridging to infamy. King John awaits. Richard's shadow fades, but the throne's next tenant is no picnic either. King John, a name that conjures groans instead of gasps, takes us from murky intrigue to outright disaster. Where Richard wrestled with rumors, John drowned in them starving enemies, losing crowns, literally, and birthing the Magna Carta under duress. Swap the tower's gloom for the reek of medieval tyranny, and let's see how John turned failure into a legacy of its own. Imagine the scene. It's 1199, and England's throne room buzzes with unease. Richard, the Lionheart, the golden boy of Plantagenet kings, has met his end, felled by a crossbow bolt in France. The crown passes to his younger brother John, a man whose reputation precedes him, like a bad smell, cunning, avaricious, and about as reliable as a leaky boat. The barons squint suspiciously, the church mutters prayers, and the peasantry hunkers down for trouble. They're right to worry. King John's reign is a roller coaster of missteps, from losing ancestral lands to picking fights with the Pope, all culminating in a document that would outshine his dismal legacy, the Magna Carta. Let's unpack this royal train wreck and see why John remains England's most reviled ruler. A shaky beginning. The reluctant king, John, born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, started life with a nickname that stuck like mud Lackland. His elder brothers, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, nagged the prime territories, leaving John with little more than a title and a chip on his shoulder. Raised in a family where rebellion was practically a rite of passage, he learned young that power wasn't inherited, it was seized. When Richard ascended in 1189, John bided his time, even attempting a coup while his brother was off crusading. It flopped, but it showed his ambition. Richard's death in 1199 thrust John onto the throne, though not without hiccups. His nephew Arthur, son of Geoffrey, had a stronger claim to the French territories, Anjou, Normandy, and the like. John, crowned at Westminster amid lukewarm cheers, wasn't about to share. He marched into France, captured Arthur, and whispered rumors say had him quietly dispatched. The boy disappeared, and John's foes pounced on the scandal. Whether true or not, the stench of treachery clung to him, poisoning his reign from the outset. Military fiascos. The empire crumbles. John's grip on power was tested early and often nowhere more disastrously than in France. In 1202, he wed Isabella of Angoulême, a move that sparked a diplomatic firestorm. She was already promised to a French noble. King Philip II of France, ever the opportunist, declared John's French lands forfeit. What followed was a masterclass in military incompetence. John's campaigns were plagued by poor strategy, unreliable allies and barons who'd rather sulk than swing a sword. By 1204, Normandy, the Plantagenet crown, jewel was lost, followed by Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. Half his empire vanished in a blink. Desperate to claw back his losses, John launched a grand comeback in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines. Teaming up with the Holy Roman Emperor and Flemish nobles, he bet big and lost bigger. The French routed them, and John limped home, his coffers empty and his reputation in tatters. His barons, who'd bankrolled this debacle, seethed. John's solution? Crank up the taxes. It was like pouring oil on a fire. His nobles were already simmering, and now they were ready to boil over. Holy war, clashing with the church. As if losing land wasn't enough, John decided to tangle with the Catholic Church, heavyweight foe in medieval Europe. The trouble brewed in 1205, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died. John pushed his crony for the job, but Pope Innocent III had his own pick, Stephen Langton, a scholar with spine. John refused to budge, barring Langton from England. Innocent retaliated in 1208, with an interdict shutting down church services across the kingdom. No baptisms, no marriages, no last rites. The spiritual blackout was a gut punch to a superstitious age. John, unfazed, raided church coffers to fund his wars, treating bishops like ATMs. In 1209, innocent escalated excommunicating him. Now John was a pariah, and his enemies secular and divine circled. By 1213, with France eyeing invasion, and his barons plotting, he folded. He welcomed Langton, repaid the church, and in a jaw-dropping twist offered England as a fief to the Pope. From king to papal vassal in one humiliating swoop, John dodged disaster, but lost any shred of dignity. The barons strike back, Magna Carta at Runnymede. By 1215, John's barons had reached their breaking point. Years of military flops, extortionate taxes, and arbitrary justice had them sharpening their swords. Led by Robert Fitzwalter, a grizzled noble with a grudge, they confronted John at Runnymede, a waterlogged patch near the Thames. On June 15th, they presented the Magna Carta list of demands dressed up as law. It wasn't a revolution. It was a baronial power grab with clauses to limit fines, protect widows, and ensure fair trials. The Biggie Clause, 61. The Security Clause gave barons the right to overrule the king if he stepped out of line. John signed, likely cursing under his breath, but the ink barely dried before he backtracked. He appealed to the Popenow, his overlord, who annulled the charter as shameful and demeaning. The barons, furious, invited Prince Louis of France to claim the throne, sparking the First Barons' War. John spent his final months dodging rebels, his kingdom fracturing around him. A miserable exit. The end of the line. John's reign sputtered out in 1216, amid chaos and indignity. Fleeing rebels, he crossed the Wash, a treacherous estuary, and lost the crown jewels to the tide. The story's probably embellished, but it fits his luck. Then, in a final twist of medieval fate, dysentery struck. He died in Newark Castle, racked by fever and filth, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry III to inherit a mess. The barons, sensing a fresh start, abandoned Louis and backed the boy king, closing John's chapter with a whimper. Magna Carta's lasting echo. Here's the irony. John's darkest hour birthed a beacon of hope. The Magna Carta, though a baronial tantrum in 1215, grew into something bigger. Reissued under Henry III, it morphed from a noble privilege into a symbol of justice. Its core idea: no one, not even a king, is above the law, echoed through centuries, shaping the English Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, and modern democracy. John the Tyrant stumbled into immortality. The villain's legacy. A cautionary tale history hasn't been kind to John. Chroniclers dubbed him Softsword for his battlefield blunders, and Lachlan for his territorial losses. Later tales, Shakespeare's plays, Robin Hood legends, even Disney's sniveling lion cast him as a cartoonish creep. Was he uniquely awful? Not really. Plenty of kings were ruthless or inept. John just had a knack for losing the PR war. His reign was a perfect storm of bad decisions, worse timing, and a gift for turning allies into enemies. Hez the king, nobody mourns, but everyone remembers. From chaos to conquest, enter. William John's reign marks a nadir in England's royal saga, a tale of weakness and woe. But the throne has seen sterner stuff. Rewind to 1066 and meet William the Conqueror, a man who didn't inherit power, but took it sword in hand. Where John flailed, William dominated, forging a kingdom from blood and grit. Let's trade this despot's debacle for a conqueror's triumph and see how England was remade. You're standing on the wind-swept cliffs of Normandy. The year is 1066, and the air hums with the scent of salt water and ambition. Across the Channel, England sprawls, ripe for the taking its throne, dangling like a prize after Edward the Confessor's death. Enter William, Duke of Normandy, a man whose name would soon echo with conquest, bloodshed, and the remaking of a nation. Has no polished prince. He's a warrior with a claim, a vision, and a ruthless edge sharp enough to slice through history. Let's wade into the muck and chaos of his world and see how this Norman warlord became England's most feared king. The bastard duke with a claim. William didn't glide into power on a velvet cushion, he clawed his way there. Born in 1028, he was the illegitimate son of Robert III, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, a tanner's daughter. His childhood moniker, William the Bastard, wasn't a compliment. It was a jab that stuck. When Robert died in 1035 during a pilgrimage, 7-year-old William inherited the duchy and a heap of trouble. Normandy's nobles smelled weakness, and his early years were a grim parade of betrayals, ambushes, and assassination attempts. He learned young that power wasn't handed over, it was seized, often with blood on the blade. By his 20s, William had tamed Normandy's chaos, crushing rebellions and marrying Matilda of Flanders to lock in alliances. But his gaze drifted across the Channel. Edward, the Confessor, England's aging king, had no heir, and William swore Edward had promised him the throne, a claim as flimsy as sea mist to some but ironclad in his mind. When Edward died in January 1066, Harold Godwinson Edward's brother-in-law crowned himself king. William cried. Fowl rallied. His knights built a fleet and set his sights on England. What came next wasn't a polite negotiation, it was war. From a scrappy duke to a claimant king, William's ambition was about to meet its ultimate test. The clash at Hastings would decide more than a crown, it would redraw England's future. The Battle of Hastings, a bloody turning point. It's October 14th, 1066, and you're slogging through the mud at Hastings, the clang of steel jarring your bones. Harold's Anglo-Saxon army, weary from crushing a Viking invasion up north, squares off against William's Norman cavalry and archers. The air's thick with sweat and fear as shields crack, arrows whistle, and the earth churns red. Harold's men lock into a shield wall, a bristling hedge of defiance, but William's cunning cuts deeper than swords. He fakes retreats, baiting the Saxons to break ranks, then sends his knights thundering through the gaps. The fight grinds on hour after brutal hour. Then as dusk creeps in, an arrow, some say, random others swear, aimed finds Harold's eye. He drops, and Anglo-Saxon England crumbles with him. William's triumph is no mere skirmish. It's a tectonic shift. By Christmas, he's crowned in Westminster Abbey, the crown heavy on his head and his grip tighter still. But winning a battle is one thing ruling. A hostile land is a beast of its own. Quirky tidbit: the Bayeux Tapestry, a 230-foot embroidered epic, spins the conquest like a medieval blockbuster. It shows Harold with that arrow in his eye, but was it really his eye? Scholars squabble over the stitchery, some calling it Norman propaganda with a flair for the dramatic. Either way, it's history's longest brag. Victory at Hastings handed William the throne, but England wasn't ready to kneel. The real struggle keeping the crown lay ahead, and it would demand a brutality that still chills the air. The harrying of the north-scorched earth and submission. William's coronation sparked defiance, not loyalty. Anglo-Saxon nobles bristling under Norman boots lit rebellions like signal fires. The fiercest blazed in 1069, when the North Yorkshire Durham and beyond rose with Danish Viking backing. William's answer wasn't diplomacy. It was the harrying of the North, a campaign so savage it scars the soul to imagine. Picture winter's bite and Norman troops sweeping villages like a reaper's scythe. Homes burn, cattle bleed. Outfields are salted. Starvation becomes a weapon. Thousands perish fleeing or freezing their bones, dotting the wasteland. A chronicler used to war's grim toll wrote of bodies piled like sheaves of corn. By 1070, The North was broken a ghost of itself. William's point was hammered home resist, and you're not just defeated, you're erased. Scholarly debate. Was the harrying a cold necessity or pure cruelty? Some defended a strategy. William had to crush the North to secure his flank. Others branded a war crime, excessive even for the age. Whatever the intent, it worked, leaving a silence that spoke louder than screams. With the North subdued, William turned from destroyer to ruler. His next move wasn't about swords. It was about ink and a book that would bind England tighter than chains. The Domesday, book taxation, and control. By 1085, William wanted England's pulse under his thumb. Enter the Domesday Book, a sprawling census of every acre, animal, and soul. Picture scribes trudging through villages, tallying pigs and plows with a taxman's glee. It wasn't just numbers, it was power. Knowing his kingdom's wealth let William squeeze it dry and leash his barons. Think of it as a medieval IRS audit. No one dodged the reckoning. The Domesday Book also redrew England's bones. Anglo-Saxon lords were ousted, replaced by Norman loyalists, cementing a feudal pyramid with William at the peak. The old order faded, buried under a new system where land meant allegiance and allegiance meant survival. From battlefield to ledger, William reshaped England's body and soul. But what he built, harsh enduring, would ripple far beyond his final breath. Legacy. A kingdom transformed. William's end came in 1087, a messy fall from his horse. During a skirmish fittingly undignified for a man who defied death so often, yet his shadow stretched long. He'd forged an Anglo-Saxon land into a Norman realm, blending cultures in ways that linger still. English itself owes him. Norman-French words like castle and justice tangle with Anglo-Saxon house and bread. The Tower of London, brooding and gray, is his stone signature. Mainstream fact. The Battle of Hastings was England's last successful invasion. No foreign army has breached its shores since, a testament to William's lock on the land. But was he a boon or a blight? Stability came at a price, massacres, misery, a rigid hierarchy. Without him, though, England might have fractured or fallen prey to others. History doesn't tally neat sums. William's ledger is a mess of triumph and trauma. William's conquest locked England's fate, but the crown's story was far from done. Centuries later, a king named Henry VIII would wield power with a flair William could only dream of. Less sword, more scandal. From conquest to courtly intrigue, Henry VIII awaits. William's iron grip forged a kingdom, but the throne he claimed would host rulers who redefined ruthlessness. Leap forward to the 16th century and meet Henry IV, a monarch whose tangled marriages and religious upheavals make William's wars seem almost tame. Where William swung a blade, Henry swung decrees, lopping off headswives and bishops alike with a tyrant's whimsy. Let's trade the battlefields, clang for the bedchambers, whispers, and see how this Tudor king rewrote royal rule. Picture yourself in the grand halls of Hampton Court, where the aroma of roasted boar mingles with the strains of lute music. Courtiers draped in velvet flit about their laughter, masking a growing unease. Beneath this glittering faud, a tempest brews. Henry VIII, a king destined to reshape England's monarchy, is warming up for a reign that'll make your head spin, sometimes literally. Known for his 6 wives, Henry's real talent lay in turning charm into terror, power into bloodshed. Let's dive into the life of this Tudor titan, where love, faith, and a sharp axe forged an unforgettable legacy. The prince who stole the show, born in 1491. Henry was the spare, not the heir-second son to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Destiny, however, had a twist in store. When his elder brother Arthur kicked the bucket in 1502, young Henry stepped into the spotlight. At 18, he claimed the throne in 1509, a strapping lad with a dazzling smile and a penchant for tennis. He was the Renaissance poster boy, athletic, musical, and adored by all. England thought they'd hit the jackpot. But Henry wasn't just a pretty face. He craved glory, launching a flashy campaign against France in 1513, snagging the Battle of the Spurs. Meanwhile, his wife Catherine of Aragon held down the fort, smashing a Scottish invasion at Flodden and sending Henry the gory spoils. Early signs of his ruthlessness. You bet. This golden boy was already sharpening his claws. A marriage mess and a church divorce. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a diplomatic Win Arthur's widow, a Spanish princess, a perfect match. But after years of miscarriages and only one surviving daughter, Mary Henry got twitchy. No male heir, unacceptable. Then along came Anne Boleyn, a dark-eyed firecracker who wouldn't settle for mistress status. She wanted the crown, and Henry Smitten was ready to burn bridges or churches to get it. Divorce wasn't on the Catholic menu, so Henry begged the Pope to annul his marriage, claiming it was cursed, thanks Bible. The Pope, bullied by Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, said no. Henry's response? Fine. I'll do it myself. In 1534, he rammed through the Act of Supremacy, crowning himself head of the Church of England. Goodbye, Rome. Hello, royal jackpot. He nabbed church wealth, annulled his marriage, and wed Anne. It was less a religious awakening and more a power play with a side of romance. Fun fact: Henry loved a good tune. He wrote Pastime with good company, but his real hit was remixing the church to suit his love life. The Wives. A Deadly Dance, Henry's marital merry-go-round is infamous. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Here's the rundown. Catherine of Aragon, dumped after 24 years, died in exile. Rumor has it, her heart was black poison, perhaps. Anne Boleyn sparked a revolution, bore Elizabeth, then flopped with no son. Beheaded for adultery in 1536, while Henry planned his next I do. Jane Seymour delivered the goods, Prince Edward in 1537, then died. Henry actually cried for this one. Anne of Cleves. A blind date gone wrong. Henry dubbed her the Flanders mare, divorced her in 6 months flat. Catherine Howard. A teenage fling turned fatal. Beheaded in 1542 for cheating her head, joined her lovers on London Bridge. Catherine Parr, the survivor. Nursed fat, grumpy Henry and dodged the axe herself. Each wife was a chess piece in Henry's gamesome one, most lost, and the board stayed bloody. Blood and power. The brutal playbook. Henry didn't mess around when it came to control. Cross him, and you'd meet the executioner. Sir Thomas More, his ex-chancellor, would in 5F3B refuse to ditch Catholicism for Henry's new church chop, Thomas Cromwell. The Reformation's brain fell from grace after the Anne of Cleves fiasco, beheaded on shaky charges. Even the monasteries weren't safe. Henry dissolved them, snagging their riches and sparking the pilgrimage of grace. The rebels begged for mercy. Henry gave them ropes instead, hanging 200 to make a point. Dark humor alert. Henry's court was like a reality show high drama, backstabbing and a guaranteed elimination every season. The fat, fearsome finale. By the 1540s, Henry was a wreck-obese, ulcer-ridden, and paranoid. His legs oozed, his temper flared, and his court tiptoed around him. He died in 1547, leaving a fractured realm. His kids, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, picked up the pieces, but his legacy was set a church split, a throne soaked in blood, and a blueprint for tyranny. To France, We Go Henry's reign was a brutal blockbuster, but the show's not over. Across the channel, Louis XV, the Spider King, spun a subtler web of cruelty. Swap the axe for intrigue, and you've got France's own dark maestro. Let's ditch the Tudors and step into his shadowy court next. Imagine standing in the dim stone-walled halls of the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, where every footstep echoes and the air hums with unspoken plots. It's the late 15th century, and France is a fractured realm, its nobles clashing like wolves over a carcass still reeling from the Hundred Years' War. At the heart of this chaos sits Louis XV, a king dubbed the Spider for his intricate webs of intrigue. His court is no place for the bold or the brash. Here power belongs to those who whisper, watch, and wait. Let's unravel the tale of this cunning ruler whose ruthless mind bent a kingdom to his will. A prince forged in shadows. Louis XIV entered the world on July 3, 1423, in Bourges, born to King Charles VII and Marie of Anjou. France was a land under siege. English forces held Paris, and the royal court was a simmering pot of distrust. Young Louis grew up sharp-eyed and sharper-witted, learning early that survival demanded more than swords. His father, Charles, was a hesitant king, plagued by indecision, and Louis bristled under his shadow. At 17, he threw himself into the Progrès, a rebellion against Charles, only to see it collapse. Banished to Dauphin, he spent years in exile, a prince without a crown, plotting and watching. Those years carved him into a man of patience and guile, mistrustful of the nobles, who had turned on his father and soon on him. When Charles VII died in 1461, Louis, now 38, returned to claim the throne. His coronation in Reims was a quiet affair, overshadowed by the sneers of nobles who saw him as a weakling in plain clothes. They underestimated him at their peril. The Spider takes the throne. Louis inherited a France teetering on the edge, scarred by war, its treasury thin, its barons hungry for power. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, loomed largest among them, a rival with wealth and armies to match the crown. In 1465, the League of the Public Weal rose against Louis, a coalition of nobles bent on breaking him. He met them not with armies, but with words, striking a fragile peace that cost him land and gold. It was a setback, but Louis was playing a longer game. He turned to his true weapons, spies' secrets, and a mind that saw 10 moves ahead. His king's ear was born a network of informants stretching from Paris slums to foreign palaces. Tavern keepers, priests, even courtiers fed him whispers of treason. Louis relished the game, often slipping out in disguise, a merchant, a pilgrim to hear his subjects' unguarded words. His unkingly appearance, stooped frame, long nose, drab robe, shid a predator's instincts, weaving a web of control. Louis' reign was a masterclass in manipulation. He didn't storm castles. He turned their lords against each other. Strategic marriages were his thread. His daughter Anne wed Peter of Bourbon, locking a key noble house to his side. His son Charles was betrothed to secure alliances abroad. He wielded propaganda like a quill, commissioning tales of his wisdom while branding rebels as devils. Astrology guided him too. He consulted the stars, claiming divine sanction for his rule. But when subtlety faltered, Louis struck hard. His iron cages became infamous, cramped, dangling prisons, where traitors like Cardinal Jean Balue languished. Balue, once a trusted advisor, had conspired with Burgundy. Louis locked him away for 11 years, visiting to taunt him with promises of freedom that never came. It was cruelty, with a purpose, a warning etched in suffering. From intrigue to iron. The line between cunning and brutality blurred often in Louis' France. In 1470, Jacques d'Armagnac, a defiant noble, knelt at the Place de Grève, his fate sealed. The crowd watched breathless as the executioner's axe fell, guided by Louis's distant, unreadable gaze. 5 years later, Louis de Luxembourg, Count of Saint-Pol, met a similar end, beheaded publicly for shifting loyalties. Louis favored torture-toothed, question extraordinaire, drowned men in water until they spilled their secrets. Yet he balanced this terror with mercy, pardoning some foes to bind them closer. It was a spider's dance trap, release trap again. His methods bore fruit. The nobles' power waned as he clawed back their lands and rights. Provence fell into his grasp through marriage and guile, swelling France's borders. He poured gold into trade and industry, coaxing a battered economy to life. The monarchy grew stronger, its roots sinking deep into the soil of a modern state. The spider's last threads. By 1483, Louis's health faltered. He retreated to Plessis-les-Tours, a paranoid shadow surrounded by guards and physicians. When he died that August, he left a France reshaped, centralized, richer, but bruised by his relentless hand. His son, Charles VIII, just 13, stepped into a legacy both brilliant and brittle, a kingdom held together by blood-soaked webs. Louis's reign was a paradox, a king who dressed like a peasant, yet thought like a chess master, who built a nation while breaking its spirit. His spies and cages linger in memory, but so does his vision of France, where the crown, not the barons, ruled supreme. To the fields of blood. Louis XVIII thrived in the shadows, his power spun from whispers and deceit. But not all kings ruled so quietly. Our next tale takes us from the spider's lair to the roar of battle, where another monarch forged his throne in steel and slaughter. While Louis ensnared this king, charged his legacy, written not in ink, but in the crimson of his enemy's blood. While Louis XV, the Spider King of Section 9, preferred to weave his webs of intrigue to maintain power, other medieval monarchs took a far less subtle approach, crushing dissent with an iron fist. Rebellions were the heartbeat of medieval unrest, pulsing through a feudal system riddled with tension between kings and their vassals. Power was a precarious prize, and a ruler's ability to stamp out uprisings often defined his legacy, whether as a unifier or a tyrant. For the kings in this section, brutality wasn't just a tactic. It was a philosophy wielded with a ferocity that left little room for mercy or misinterpretation. William the Conqueror, the harrying of the North. Take William the Conqueror, whose iron grip on England was forged in blood and ash. After his 1066 victory at Hastings, he faced a barrage of Anglo-Saxon rebellions, particularly in the north, where defiance simmered like a stubborn ember. His response in 1070, the harrying of the North, was less a military campaign and more a scorched earth apocalypse. Entire villages were torched, livestock slaughtered, and fields razed, leaving survivors to starve in a wasteland of his making. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis claimed more than $100,000 perished of hunger, a figure debated by modern scholars, but undisputed in its horror. This wasn't just suppression, it was a message carved into the landscape: resist, and annihilation follows. The North fell silent, and William's rule solidified, though at the cost of a depopulated realm. Edward I's Longshanks and the rebels' end. Fast forward to Edward I, England's towering Longshanks, whose reign in the late 13th century was a masterclass in relentless domination. In Wales, he crushed Prince Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's 1282 rebellion with a hammer blow, erecting castles like Caernarfon. As stone sentinels of his triumph, Llywelyn's severed head became a grisly trophy paraded through London. Scotland tested Edward's patience next with William Wallace igniting resistance. After the 1298 Battle of Falkirk, Edward captured Wallace in 1305 and staged an execution that doubled as theater hanged drawn and quartered. Wallace's remains were scattered across the kingdom. Edward didn't just defeat rebels. He turned their deaths into propaganda, ensuring every subject knew the price of defiance. Ivan the Terrible, the Oprichnina, unleashed across Europe. Ivan the Terrible of Russia elevated brutality to a grotesque art form. In 1565, he unleashed the Oprichnina, a shadowy force of black-robed enforcers who swept through his realm like a plague. Their saddles bore brooms and dogs, head-squirky symbols of their mission to sweep away and sniff out treason. When Ivan suspected Novgorod of disloyalty in 1570, his oprichniki descended, slaughtering thousands and tossing bodies into the icy Volkhov River. Estimates of the dead range wildly from $2,000 to $60,000 a testament to the chaos they wrought. Ivan's paranoia even turned inward, famously killing his son with a staff in a fit of rage. The Oprichnina wasn't governance, it was terror breaking the nobility and leaving Russia reeling. Basil II, the Bulgar Slayers, blinding legacy. In the Byzantine Empire, Basil II earned his moniker, Bulgar Slayer, with a chilling act of calculated cruelty. After the 1014 Battle of Kleidion, he crushed a Bulgarian uprising and captured 15,000 men. His punishment, blinding them all, sparing 1 in 100 a single eye to lead the stumbling horde back home. Legend says the sight killed Tsar Samuel of shock. Scholars still argue if the numbers were inflated by later chroniclers, but the psychological scars were real Basil's. Borders stayed secure, his enemies cowed by a legacy written in mutilation. Beyond the usual suspects, brutality wasn't confined to these headliners. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mutasim crushed the Zanj rebellion in the 9th century, leaving tens of thousands dead and the rebel leaders head on a spear. Henry I of Germany depopulated Slavic lands in his 10th century campaigns against the Wends. Philip IV of France, meanwhile, turned on the Knights Templar, torturing confessions out of them before burning their leaders alive in 1314. Each king wielded violence like a scepter, proving dissent was a spark to be snuffed out with fire. Did it work short-term? Yes, brutality delivered results. William's harrying silenced England's North Edwards, campaigns tamed Wales, and rattled Scotland Ivan's. Terror centralized power, and Basil's blinding secured Byzantium. Fear was a potent leash, but the long game was uglier. Northern England became a ghost land. Russia's elite crumbled under Ivan's madness, and Basil's harshness bred simmering hatred. These kings bought obedience at the cost of stability, their realms often weaker for it. A language of violence. For these monarchs, brutality was more than a tool. It was a dialect of power spoken fluently and without apology. Mercy was a weakness they couldn't afford in a world where loyalty was fleeting and rebellion perennial. Their reigns soaked in blood stand as grim monuments to a medieval truth control came at a price paid by the defiant and the innocent alike. Having seen these kings smash rebellion with unrelenting force, let's shift our lens to the quieter but no less brutal machinery of their realms. In Section 11, we'll delve into the dark heart of medieval justice, where royal retribution wasn't reserved for uprisings alone, but woven into the daily fabric of law and punishment, blurring the line between order and tyranny. While kings like William the Conqueror and Edward the Hun crushed rebellions with brute force, their methods of maintaining order extended far beyond the battlefield. In the courts, dungeons, and public squares of their realms, justice was dispensed with equal ruthlessness. Medieval justice was a brutal, affair-swift, merciless, and often arbitrary, where the king's word was law and punishments were crafted to inspire terror as much as obedience. From the gallows to the torture rack, royal retribution was a grim spectacle, reinforcing the crown's authority over every soul in the kingdom. The kings, justice courts, and laws. In medieval Europe, the king sat atop a chaotic pyramid of justice, his authority absolute. Royal courts, such as England's Court of the King's Bench, dealt with serious crime, treason, murder, rebellion, but the king could override any verdict with a flick of his quill. The legal system was a messy stew of ancient customs, feudal duties, and royal proclamations applied inconsistently across regions and classes. For the average peasant, justice was a distant nightmare. They had no shield against the whims of their lords or the king's decrees. Even the Magna Carta of 1215, often hailed as a cornerstone of liberty, was more a baronial power grab than a shield for the common folk. It curbed King John's excesses, but only for the elite. By the late Middle Ages, courts like the Star Chamber under Henry VII and Henry VIII took secrecy and severity to new heights. Shrouded in mystery, this tribunal operated without juries, targeting nobles and officials who dared to displease the crown. Its whispered proceedings and harsh sentences made it a bogeyman of royal justice, proving that even the powerful weren't safe from the king's long arm. Punishments and executions. Fear in full view. Medieval punishments were public theater staged to sear the king's power into the minds of onlookers. Hanging was the workhorse of executions. Thieves, murderers, and petty rebels dangled from ropes in town squares, their bodies left to rot as carrion birds circled. For graver offenses like treason, the punishment escalated to drawing and quartering. The condemned were hanged until the brink of death. Then disemboweled alive, their guts burned before their fading eyes, before being beheaded and hacked into quarters. William Wallace faced this in 1305 under Edward I. His limbs scattered across England and Scotland as a grisly postcard of royal vengeance. Heretics and witches met the flames. Burning at the stake was both punishment and purification. Joan of Arc, the teenage warrior saint, was torched in 1431, her execution a public lesson in defying the church and crown. In 1314, Philip IV of France incinerated the Knights Templars' leaders after torturing confessions of heresy, erasing a once mighty order in a blaze of royal retribution. These weren't just deaths. They were propaganda bloody banners of the king's unyielding will. Torture and confessions. Breaking body and soul torture was the dark heart of medieval justice, a tool to wring truth or submission from the accused. The rack stretched victims until joints popped, the thumbscrew pulverized fingers with agonizing precision, and water torture drowned them in slow, choking waves. The goal wasn't always justice. False confessions were as good as true ones if they served the king's purpose. The Knights Templars' 1307 trial saw knights confess to wild heresies under duress, only to retract them later too late to escape the pyre. Torture was less about evidence and more about power, a reminder that the king could break anyone. Grim fact. Some torturers were paid per confession, turning agony into a side hustle. Efficiency was key. Why waste time on innocence? Trial by ordeal and combat God's verdict. Without forensics, medieval justice leaned on divine intervention. Trial by ordeal tested guilt through suffering, trusting God to spare the righteous. In trial by fire, the accused gripped a red-hot iron. If their burns healed cleanly, they walked free. Trial by water dunked them in a pond. Floating meant guilt, as pure water supposedly rejected sinners. Trial by combat, pitted accuser against accused the winner, blessed by heavenly favor. Emma of Normandy, accused of adultery, reportedly strode over glowing plowshares, unscathed her miracle, silencing her foes. These practices faded by the 13th century, but they reveal a justice system rooted in superstition and brutality. Justice, for the nobility privilege, meets the axe commoners, bore the raw edge of justice, but nobles had perks until they didn't. They could demand trial by peers dodging the rabbles. Fate and their executions swapped the noose for the axe, a dignified end. Yet crossing the king erased those privileges fast. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, lost her head in 1536 on charges of adultery and treason likely fabricated to clear his path to Jane Seymour. Thomas More, a loyal chancellor, turned dissenter, was beheaded in 1535 for rejecting Henry's break with Rome. Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, fell in 1521, his treasonous whispers ending in a public chop. Noble or not, the king's justice spared no one when power was at stake. The cost of control. Medieval justice was a machine of fear. Executions drew crowds, torture silenced dissent, and every severed head reinforced the crown's grip. But it wasn't foolproof. For every rebel quartered or heretic burned defiance festered in the shadows. The king's retribution kept order, yes, but it also fueled the grudges that would one day topple thrones. It was a tightrope walk between control and chaos, and the blood never stopped flowing. But the brutality of medieval justice wasn't just for thieves and traitors. Kings wielded it to crush rivals and cement their rule, turning courts into weapons of succession. In the next section, we'll dive into how these monarchs navigated the bloody game of thrones wars of succession and ruthless purges, where justice was just another word for survival. In the medieval world, royal justice was a blunt instrument enforcing order through fear and retribution. Yet when a monarch died without a named successor, that fragile order crumbled, unleashing chaos that engulfed entire kingdoms. Wars of succession erupted as rival claimants. Siblings, cousins, or distant relatives vied for the crown in savage contests of power. These were not noble crusades, but primal struggles fueled by ambition and settled with steel. The winners didn't merely inherit thrones. They seized them, leaving trails of blood and broken realms in their wake. The anarchy, England's brutal standoff. England's anarchy 1135 and 1153 stands as a grim testament to this chaos. When King Henry I died in 1135, his daughter Matilda and nephew Stephen both laid claim to the throne. Stephen moved swiftly, seizing the crown, while Matilda rallied support from abroad. The result was nearly 2 decades of civil war. Castles fell. Barons flipped allegiance with the wind, and the peasantry suffered untold misery. In 1141, Matilda's forces captured Stephen, but her arrogance lost her London's favor, and he escaped. The conflict limped on until 1153, when a worn-out Stephen agreed to name Matilda's son Henry as his heir. Peace was restored, but England emerged a hollowed-out ruin, its people and land exhausted. The 100 Years. War, dynastic devastation. The 100 Years' War, 1337–1453, escalated succession disputes to a grand scale, pitting England against France in a relentless struggle. It began when Edward III of England, leveraging his French maternal lineage, claimed the French throne after Charles IV's death left no direct heir. France countered by crowning Philip VI, igniting a 116-year ordeal of carnage. Iconic victories like Crecy, 1346, and Agincourt 1415 burnished England's reputation. But the wars, endless sieges, raids, and plagues ravaged both nations. By 1453, England retained only Calais, while France clawed its way to recovery. The war birthed national identities, but its cost was a generation of ruin and resentment. The Wars of the Roses, a family's fatal rift. Closer to home, the Wars of the Roses, 1455, 1487, saw England tear itself apart over the same Plantagenet bloodline. The houses of Lancaster and York, rival branches of the royal family, fought with feral intensity. The Battle of Towton, 1461, alone claimed 28,000 lives, staining the snow crimson in a single day's slaughter. Richard III's brief infamous reign, secured some say by murdering his nephews, ended in 1485 at Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor cut him down. As Henry VII, he united the warring houses through marriage, but the wounds of this kin-against-kin conflict festered a stark warning of familial ambition turned deadly. The Castilian War of Succession, Isabella's iron will. In Spain, the Castilian War of Succession, 1475–1479, was a fierce contest of legitimacy and might. After Henry IV's death in 1474, his half-sister Isabella and niece Joanna vied for Castile's throne. Portugal backed Joanna, hoping to dominate Castile, while Aragon supported Isabella and her husband Ferdinand. The war unfolded through grinding sieges and bloody skirmishes, with Isabella's strategic resolve prevailing by 1479. Her triumph not only secured her crown, but laid the foundation for a unified Spain alongside Ferdinand. Yet this victory, tempered by the shadow of the Inquisition, was forged in a crucible of violence and sacrifice. The Ottoman fratricide. A throne soaked in blood. The Ottoman Empire took succession strife to a chilling extreme. Sultan Mehmed II formalized fratricide in the 15th century, decreeing that a new sultan must kill his brothers to eliminate threats. Bayezid II followed this in 1481, and Selim Afur expanded the bloodshed in 1512, executing brothers, nephews, and cousins alike. This gruesome tradition ensured stability until later sultans opted for imprisonment over murder in the 17th century. The early Ottoman sultans' willingness to slaughter their own kin underscored a brutal truth: the throne's value outweighed even the closest bonds. The cost of ambition, a people's plight. These wars were not mere games of thrones. They were disasters for those beneath the crowns. During England's, anarchy chroniclers lamented a land where Christ and his saints slept abandoned to lawlessness and starvation. The 100 Years' War left French villages smoldering, their inhabitants butchered or displaced by roving armies. The Wars of the Roses gutted England's aristocracy, erasing noble lines in a frenzy of vengeance. Commoners bore the brunt fields, torched economies stalled, and lives snuffed out in service of royal greed. These conflicts were engines of destruction grinding through populations with merciless efficiency. Still, their fallout shaped the medieval world. The 100 Years' War crystallized English and French identities. The Wars of the Roses strengthened the Tudor monarchy, and Isabella's victory birthed a Spanish powerhouse. The survivors of these bloodbaths didn't just claim power, they redefined their kingdoms, often with a ruthlessness that reverberated through history. The Wars of Succession were savage crucibles testing the limits of loyalty and endurance. Yet for those who emerged victorious, securing the throne was only the beginning. In the next section, we'll delve into how these monarchs stamped out remaining rivals with calculated precision through poison, exile, or execution, ensuring their grip on power was ironclad. Their methods were as diverse as they were lethal, revealing the dark art of kingship in an age of unrelenting strife. The Wars of Succession left thrones drenched in blood. But even after the crown was won, medieval kings faced a relentless challenge: rivals who lingered like shadows threatening to unravel their hard-fought victories. Whether they were scheming nobles, disgruntled kin, or foreign pretenders, these threats demanded swift, merciless elimination. For the brutal monarchs of this era, securing power wasn't enough. They had to erase any spark of opposition using methods as varied as poison betrayal and the executioner's blade. Let's step into their courts, where trust was a luxury and survival meant striking first. The game of rivals, a throne under siege. In the medieval world, a king's power was only as strong as his ability to neutralize threats. Rivals weren't just enemies. They were existential risks capable of rallying armies, inciting rebellions, or swaying foreign powers. A brother with a claim, a noble with too much gold, or a distant cousin whispering in a foreign court could unravel a kingdom overnight. The kings who thrived didn't wait for danger to knock. They hunted it down, often with a brutality that made their battlefield triumphs look tame. This wasn't justice. It was survival played with a predator's precision. Richard III, the princes in the Tower. Let's start with Richard III, whose brief reign in England was a masterclass in cutting loose ends, maybe too literally. After seizing the throne in 1483, by declaring his nephews Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury illegitimate, he sent the boys to the Tower of London for their safety. By late 1483, they vanished, sparking whispers that still echo today. Did Richard order their murder, perhaps smothered in their sleep to snuff out their claim? Or did he stash them away only for someone else like his rival? Henry Tudordo finished the job later. Historians still argue whether Richard was the villain or a scapegoat. But the boy's disappearance cleared his path, at least until Bosworth Field in 1485, where Henry Tudor's sword ended his reign. The prince's fate remains a grim reminder in the Game of Thrones, loose ends don't last long. Quirky tidbit. In 1674, workers digging in the tower found a box with two child-sized skeletons presumed to be the princes. Charles II buried them in Westminster Abbey, but modern tests are stalled. Guess the royals don't want their laundry aired. Ivan the Terrible, a family affair across the continent. Ivan the Terrible turned rival slaying into a personal crusade. His paranoia saw threats in every corner, even his own blood. In 1581, during a heated argument, he struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with a staff, killing him in a fit of rage. It wasn't just a family spat gone wrong, it erased his dynasty's future, leaving a feeble successor in Fyodor III. Beyond kin, Ivan Soprichniki hunted boyars with zeal, accusing them of treason on flimsy pretexts. One noble, Ivan Kurakin, was boiled alive in a cauldron, a spectacle meant to terrify others into submission. Ivan's purges didn't just eliminate rivals. They gutted Russia's elite, leaving a void that would haunt the realm long after his death in 1584. Louis VI, the spiders, silent strikes. Francis, Louis XI, the Spider King, preferred a subtler blade. His web of spies sniffed out dissent before it could bloom, and his punishments were as precise as they were cruel. Take Cardinal Jean Ballou, once a trusted advisor who flirted with treason by siding with Burgundy. Louis didn't execute him, he locked Ballou in a custom iron cage for 11 years, suspended like a bird with just enough space to breathe and suffer. The cage wasn't just punishment. It was a warning to others whispered in courtly halls. Another rival, the Count of St. Pol, faced the axe in 1475. After double dealing with England, his public execution at the Place de Grève was a grim spectacle staged to cow Paris' restless nobles. Louis' genius was in blending terror with restraint, ensuring his enemies vanished without sparking outright revolt. Dark humor. Alert Louis' cages were so cozy, They came with a view of his mercy if you begged hard enough. Spoiler, nobody did. Vlad the Impaler. A Forest of Fear. Vlad the Impaler. Wallachius Nightmare took a more theatrical approach. His rivals, boyars, Ottoman envoys, even petty thieves ended up on stakes, their bodies lining roads like grotesque signposts. In 1459, he hosted a feast for disloyal nobles, only to impale them mid-banquet, turning their screams into dinner music. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans, Vlad nailed them to their skulls, a diplomatic no that echoed across empires. His forest of 20,000 impaled Ottomans in 1462 sent Sultan Mehmed II packing, proving that Vlad's rival killing wasn't just brutality, was strategic cowing enemies into retreat. His methods were so effective that Wallachius' crime rate plummeted. Nobody dared steal when the punishment was a slow vertical ride. The Byzantine edge, Basil Sue's ruthless efficiency. In the Byzantine Empire, Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, didn't mess around with rival claimants. After crushing the Bulgarian uprising in 1014, he blinded 15,000 prisoners, leaving 1 in every 100 with a single eye to guide them home, a sight that reportedly killed Tsar Samuel from shock. Back in Constantinople, Basil faced internal threats from powerful generals like Bardas Phocas, who rebelled in 987. Basil's response? Lure Phocas into a trap, defeat him in single combat, and parade his head as a trophy. Basil's purges ensured no rival could challenge his throne, cementing a reign that stretched Byzantium's borders but left its soul colder. Mainstream fact: Basil II's blinding of the Bulgarians is recorded in Byzantine chronicles, a rare instance of mass mutilation used as psychological warfare, securing his eastern frontier for decades. The cost of ruthlessness, a fragile legacy. Eliminating rivals worked up to a point. Richard III's gambit bought him 2 years before Bosworth's betrayal. Ivan's purges centralized power, but left Russia brittle ripe for the time of troubles. Louis XIX's cunning built a stronger France, yet his paranoia alienated allies. Vlad's terror kept Wallachia free, but made him a target dead by 1476. Basil II's iron rule stabilized Byzantium, but his lack of heirs sparked succession woes. Each king's ruthlessness secured the present at the expense of the future, their thrones built on sand as much as stone. Scholarly debate. Did these purges strengthen or weaken their realms? Some argue the short-term stability justified the blood. Others say the loss of talent and trust sowed seeds of collapse. The jury's still out, but the body count isn't. From rivals to reverberations. These kings didn't just eliminate rivals. They reshaped their worlds, their actions rippling through time. In the next section, we'll explore how their brutal legacies endure, from the laws they forged to the fears they instilled, crafting a medieval shadow that lingers in our modern age. Step from the executioner's block to the echoes of history where the past whispers lessons we can't ignore. As you've seen, medieval kings like Richard III and Vlad the Impaler didn't just eliminate rivals, they carved their names into history with blood-soaked blades. Their brutal reigns, steeped in ambition and terror, didn't vanish with their deaths. Instead, they left ripples that shaped nations' laws and even the stories we tell today. From the foundations of modern governance to the myths that haunt our imaginations, the legacy of these ruthless monarchs is a complex tapestry of progress and pain. Let's wander through the echoes of their rule and see how their iron fists forged a world that still feels their weight. The foundations of power. Centralizing the state brutality wasn't just a power grab, it was a tool for nation building. Take Louis XIV, the Spider King, whose cunning purges of rebellious nobles in 15th century France crushed feudal fragmentation. By dismantling the power of dukes and counts, he centralized authority, paving the way for the absolutist monarchies of Louis XIV and beyond. His spies and cages weren't just cruel. They were the scaffolding of a unified France with a stronger crown and a bureaucracy that outlasted his scheming. Similarly, Ivan the Terrible's Oprichnina, though a reign of terror, broke the boyar's grip, planting seeds for Russia's imperial might, even if it left scars that bled into the time of troubles. William the Conqueror's legacy is even more tangible. His 1066 conquest didn't just swap one king for another, it reshaped England's DNA. The Domesday Book, that obsessive ledger of every pig and plow, wasn't just a taxman's dream. It was a blueprint for feudal control binding lords to the crown in a system that endured for centuries. His Norman castle stone giants, like the Tower of London still, loom as symbols of dominance, their shadows whispering of the harrying of the North's cost. Mainstream fact: the Domesday Book, completed in 1086, is one of the most detailed records of medieval land ownership preserved today in England's National Archives and still consulted by historians. Laws born in blood, the Magna Carta, and beyond. Even the most despised kings left legal footprints. King John, the poster child for royal failure, stumbled into immortality through the Magna Carta of 1215. Forced by his barons to curb his tyranny, John's reluctant signature birthed a document that limited royal power, sort of. It was less a democratic revolution and more a noble tantrum protecting baronial rights over peasant ones. Yet over time, its clauses on fair trials and lawful governance grew into cornerstones of English law, influencing the U.S. Constitution and modern human rights charters. John's legacy: a paradox where his weakness sparked a stronger rule of law. Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1534 was another brutal pivot with lasting impact. By declaring himself head of the Church of England, he didn't just ditch Catherine of Aragon, rewrote England's spiritual and political landscape. The dissolution of monasteries flooded his coffers, but also shattered a Catholic tradition, paving the way for Protestantism's rise. The Anglican Church, with its blend of reform and royal control, still shapes Britain's identity, a testament to Henry's axe-wielding ambition. Dark humor. Alert. Henry's church makeover was like a divine divorce: same vows, new management, and a lot of heads rolling in the process. Cultural echoes, myths, and monsters. The brutality of these kings didn't just shape laws, it fueled legends. Vlad the Impaler's stake-lined roads inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, turning a Wallachian warlord into a cape-wearing icon. Today, Romanian tourism thrives on Vlad's grim fame, with Bran Castle drawing crowds eager for a bite of history. Richard III, smeared by Shakespeare as a hunchbacked fiend, became the ultimate stage villain, his winter of discontent a literary earworm. Yet his 2012 rediscovery under a Leicester parking lot sparked a redemption arc, with the Richard III Society arguing he was more scapegoat than monster. Their stories, twisted by time, prove that a king's brutality can outlive his bones. Quirky tidbit: in 1980, a Romanian winery launched Dracula wine, a cheeky nod to Vlad's bloody legacy, perfect for pairing with a steak dinner. The human cost a shadow on progress. For all their achievements, these kings' legacies came at a staggering price. The harrying of the North left entire regions of England depopulated, with chroniclers lamenting a land laid waste for decades. Ivan's purges gutted Russia's nobility, destabilizing the state and setting the stage for chaos after his death. Henry VIII's executions, friends, wives, advisors created a court where fear replaced loyalty, while his religious upheaval sparked decades of sectarian strife. Even Louis XVIII, the master manipulator, alienated allies with his paranoia, leaving France stronger, but its people wary of the crown's cold embrace. The peasantry, as always, bore the brunt. Taxes to fund wars, famines from scorched fields, and arbitrary justice turned their lives into a gamble with grim odds. Yet their resilience rebuilding villages, enduring purges, wove the unseen threads of these kingdoms' survival. The king's brutality built nations, but it was the people's endurance that sustained them. A modern mirror power and its price. The echoes of these reigns resonate beyond medieval borders. The centralized states they forged laid groundwork for modern governments, where authority flows from institutions, not swords. The Magna Carta's faint promise of justice evolved into legal systems that check even the mightiest leaders well most of the time. But the darker lessons linger too unchecked. Power breeds fear, and brutality, however effective, sows seeds of unrest. Today's debates over governance, from democratic checks to authoritarian crackdowns, carry faint whispers of these kings' choices. Their stories remind you that power wielded without restraint can build empires or burn them down. Scholarly debate: did these brutal reigns strengthen their kingdoms or sow long-term instability? Some historians argue the centralized power they created was a necessary step toward modern states. Others say the human and social costs weakened their realms, inviting future collapse. The balance sheet of history remains contentious. From echoes to endings, the legacies of these brutal kings' castles, laws, myths stand as monuments to their reigns, but their era was not eternal. As the medieval world gave way to new ideas and powers, the age of iron-fisted monarchs began to fade. In the next section, we'll explore how this brutal epic waned, ushering in a dawn where crowns carried less weight and new forces reshaped the stage. Step from the echoes of the past into the twilight of their rule, where history turns a page. The echoes of brutal King William's conquests, Vlad's stakes evens, purges, still linger in the castles and chronicles of the medieval world, as we saw in their lasting legacies. Yet even the mightiest tyrants couldn't hold back the tides of change. By the late Middle Ages, the iron grip of these monarchs began to loosen, giving way to new ideas, powers, and systems that reshaped Europe. The age of unchecked brutality faded not with a single blow, but with a slow, relentless shift toward a new dawn. Let's walk through this twilight, where the shadows of crowns grew faint and a different world emerged, the waning of absolute power. Medieval kings ruled by fear and force, their thrones propped up by swords and dread. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, cracks appeared in this foundation. The Black Death, sweeping through Europe from 1347 to 1351, killed millions, up to a third of the population, in some regions shattering feudal economies. With labor scarce, peasants demanded better wages and rights, challenging the lords who served the king. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England saw commoners storm London, burning palaces and beheading officials, a sign that the old order wasn't untouchable. Kings like Richard II crushed these uprisings, but the message was clear. The downtrodden had a voice, however faint. Meanwhile, barons and nobles, once cowed by royal terror, grew bolder. The Magna Carta of 1215, forced from King John's reluctant hands, was a seed that sprouted over centuries. By the 15th century, England's parliament began flexing its muscle, demanding a say in taxation and governance. In France, Louis XVIII's centralized state ironically empowered his successors to negotiate with estates, general early assemblies that hinted at shared power. Absolute rule didn't vanish overnight, but it was no longer a given. Kings had to bargain, not just butcher. Mainstream fact. The Black Death, peaking around 1348, killed an estimated 30–50% of Europe's population, reshaping social and economic structures and weakening feudal hierarchies. The rise of new forces. As royal brutality waned, other powers filled the void. The church, long a partner in crowns, cruelty faced its own reckoning. The Great Schism, 1378–1417, split the papacy, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon hurling excommunications like darts. This chaos eroded the church's moral clout, paving the way for reformers like John Wycliffe and John Hus, who challenged papal authority and inspired the Protestant Reformation a century later. Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1534, while driven by personal whims, rode this wave, proving kings could defy popes without divine lightning strikes. Merchants and cities also rose their wealth, rivaling royal treasuries. The Hanseatic League, a network of trading cities in northern Europe, flexed economic muscle that kings couldn't ignore. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice, bankrolled by families like the Medici, thrived on trade and art, not royal decrees. These new players didn't need swords, they had gold, and with it influence. Kings, who once burned villages, now courted bankers, a shift from terror to negotiation. Quirky tidbit. In 15th century Bruges, merchants built a crane powered by a treadmill to unload ship-surly tech that showed cities didn't need kings to innovate. The printing press, a quiet revolution. Nothing shook the old order, like the printing press introduced by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450. Books once rare and copied by monks became cheap and widespread. Ideas spread like wildfire. Critiques of kings' calls for reform. Even tales of Vlad the Impaler's horrors reached eager readers. By 1500, millions of books circulated, fueling literacy and dissent. The press didn't topple thrones, but it armed minds, making it harder for kings to rule by fear alone. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses in 1517, the press ensured his words echoed far beyond Wittenberg, a spark that would burn through the old world. The dawn of exploration and enlightenment. The late Middle Ages also saw horizons expand literally. Christopher Columbus, for instance, 92. Voyage backed by Spain's. Ferdinand and Isabella kicked off an age of exploration that shifted power from landlocked tyrants to seafaring nations. Gold from the Americas filled royal coffers, but it also funded merchants and adventurers who answered to no crown. This global gaze weakened the insular brutality of medieval kings, as wealth and power flowed beyond their grasp. Intellectual currents stirred too. The Renaissance, blooming in Italy and spreading north, celebrated reason over divine right. Scholars like Erasmus questioned the Church's grip, while artists like Leonardo da Vinci dreamed beyond feudal confines. These ideas didn't dethrone kings, but they planted seeds for the Enlightenment, where absolute rule would face its reckoning. The brutal monarchs with their stakes and axes began to look like relics in a world craving light. Dark humor alert. Imagine Vlad trying to impale a printing press. It just keeps spitting out pamphlets mocking his stakes. The legacy of decline. The decline of brutal kingship wasn't clean or kind. The Wars of the Roses ended with Henry VII's victory in 1485, but England's stability came at the cost of noble bloodlines. France's centralized state, built by Louis XVIII, birthed absolutism that would spark revolution centuries later. Russia's Ivan IV left a fractured realm, its people haunted by his purges. Yet from this twilight emerged stronger institutions, parliaments, legal codes, and a merchant class that would define the modern age. The king's brutality forged nations, but their decline allowed those nations to breathe. Scholarly debate. Did the decline of brutal kingship strengthen or destabilize Europe? Some argue it birthed modern governance. Others say it traded one chaos for another, with new powers like merchants and reformers stirring unrest. The answer depends on whether you see progress in the ashes. A new world awaits. The age of brutal kings fades their crowns, dimming in the light of new ideas and powers. As we close this journey, let's reflect on a world transformed not by terror, but by the slow, stubborn march of change. In the final moments, we'll linger in the calm of this new dawn, where the echoes of the past grow soft and a quieter future beckons. The firelight flickers low now, casting soft shadows across the room. You've walked through the blood and ambition of medieval kings, from Vlad's grim forests to Henry's axe-wielding court, and seen their brutal reigns give way to a new era. The clatter of swords fades, replaced by the hum of printing presses and the murmur of merchants charting distant seas. These tyrants with their stakes and purges shaped a world that's now a distant memory, their names softened by time. You're safe here, far from their reach, wrapped in the quiet of your own space. Let the weight of their stories slip away like leaves on a gentle stream. The past is done, its lessons whispered, its terrors stilled. Close your eyes, feel the calm settle, and drift into the peace of now. Sleep well, knowing the dawn is yours.